And John Verry, please take it away.
Very good, Orly. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stuart Itkin. I'm the Vice President of CMMC and FedRAMP Assurance for Coalfire Federal. Joining me today, John.
Good morning or good afternoon, I guess, depends on where you are. John Verry, I'm the managing partner with PivotPoint Security. We're an organization that helps organizations that need to become provably secure and compliant do so. As you might imagine, CMMC is a quite frequent ask these days.
And certainly a topic of interest for all of us that are here today. Today, what John and I thought that we would address is critical success factors, or are the critical success factors for being able to successfully satisfy the CMMC requirements for the level at which you need to certify, or to perhaps put another way, to be able to achieve the requisite level of cyber maturity that's required to satisfy those requirements. And through this, we want to talk about as well some of the challenges that we're seeing organizations that are going through this process that are facing. And I can start, I think, maybe with just kind of the comment that first, this is not a technical issue. It's not a compliance issue. And when we talk about achieving the requisite level of cyber maturity, we certainly heard at the onset of the CMMC program conversations coming from Katie Arrington and others, is this was not about compliance. It's about focusing on maturity. And to some extent, a lot of the conversation is devolved again to compliance. What do we need to do to comply with CMMC? And perhaps the most important lesson that we've learned in working with organizations is it's not about thinking about how do I comply with CMMC, but how do I think about the requisite level of cyber maturity that is required to be able to satisfy those requirements as an organization and ultimately be ready for a CMMC certification. And if there's one thing that comes out of this, it's clear that this is an initiative within any organization that needs to be sponsored from the very top of the organizations. We've seen some companies that have come to us, an individual who has said, hey, I've been asked to do the CMMC thing. The boss told me that I needed to do this. And our first reaction is, well, do you have the buy-in and the support of the organization as a whole? And if not, a first step that we want to take with that organization, or we suggest, is, let's have a conversation, with the management of the company. Let's make sure that they understand this is not about dollars and cents. This is really about company culture and about the way that you're going to do business and think about doing your business going forward. So John, you see a lot of difference between CMMC and kind of other compliance requirements that organizations have. I know that you work with ISO 27001, CMMI. How is this different for organizations that you've been working with?
Yeah, I think fundamentally, and I think you said this at the beginning in your intro, is that this isn't really any different than any other standard, and this isn't about compliance. This is about becoming secure. Becoming secure to ensure the long-term survival of your organization, also to protect our national sovereignty, right? Because the CUI is so critical to us. From a delta between it and other frameworks, honestly, most frameworks fundamentally all work the same way. It's all about understanding what information you have, what protection mechanisms are required by it. So think about, how does that data flow through your organization, to your organization, back out of your organization? What are the laws and regulations that govern its operation? How does that overlay with your business objectives, right? So having a clear picture of where you are and where you're needing to get to. As part of that, you're always going to conduct a risk assessment. That's a fundamental concept within any standard. Generally speaking, most frameworks or standards or attestations have a set of prescriptive or non-prescriptive controls that you use as a benchmark for ensuring that you've got the right security practices in place to manage risk to an effective level. So you might hear the term gap assessment, you might hear the term control maturity assessment. So you're going to look at those controls and make sure that you've got the controls that you need in place. And then from that point forward, they all work the same. you're going to have identified some risks that need to be fixed. You're going to identify some control gaps that need to be closed. You're going to execute those, and then you're going to be ready for some type of an assessment. So it works fundamentally the same as ISO, SOC 2, FedRAMP. They all use the same fundamental approach.
Yeah, John, where I see the fundamental or the approach is fundamental, we've still seen one large difference, and a difference that we need to get organizations to understand as we start the process. We work a lot with FedRAMP. We're a large FedRAMP 3 PAO and advisory services firm as well. And FedRAMP is nice in the sense that what is being assessed or what we're providing advisory on pretty well contained, and you can look at it. It's easily identified. It's the system or the cloud service in the case of FedRAMP, that you're looking at being able to assess and ultimately get approved. With respect to CMMC, it's less about the system and it's more about the information. And sometimes that information can be scattered all over the organization. And part of the challenge with CMMC, we've seen that is different. And I think you touched upon it, is that organizations need to understand which information really does need to be protected. What are the requirements that are affecting that information? It's not just CMMC that could be affecting it. And then what is it they need to do to contain that information, as opposed to starting with a problem that is well contained?
Yeah, no, I agree. And FedRAMP, it tends to be, like you said, it's specific to a cloud service provider. But if you look at ISO, if you look at SOC 2, that principle of understanding the flow of data and understanding exactly what data you have and exactly what regulations apply to it are part of what we call context or scope, right? Understanding our scope. And one of the most critical steps for any organization proceeding towards CMMC or NIST 800-171 for that matter, is to ensure that you understand the scope. The general test that you use is what we call store, process, or transit. So any system or person or third party or application that either stores, processes, or transits either FCI, federal contract information, or CUI, controlled unclassified information, will be in the scope of your CUI enclave, and will be what you're documenting in your system security plan. So ensuring that we've got that scope perfect, and you can think of scope as the easiest way to arrive at a scope is to understand like a data flow. Think of it as being a data flow diagram. How does that data arrive? How does that data live within your environment? How does that data leave your environment? And then one last thing is, please don't just concentrate on FCI and CUI. You may have information that has additional requirements above and beyond that, most notably ITAR, because if you do, that is going to change the way that you're going to implement some of your CMMC controls and or where you're going to end up storing your information.
Yeah, and every organization that that we've worked with, that we've talked to, represents a different problem. A small organization that is exclusively doing government contract work, may have a very well-defined enclave in which CUI exists. There's others that that we've spoken with, others that we've worked with that have both commercial businesses and have government businesses. And while we want to, as you described, identify the flow of information, kind of what's received, what's stored, what's processed, what's forwarded, sometimes in some organizations, that we find that the commercial information is intermingled with the government information, and information that needs to be protected is with information that that perhaps may not even be capable of being protected under some of these regulations that referring to. What have you seen, and how have you addressed that with some of the organizations that you've worked with?
Yeah, we've got multiple clients we're working with currently that have had long-standing ISO 27001 certifications, and now have been NIST 800-171 conforming under the DFAR 7012 clause, and are now moving towards a full DFAR 7020, 7021 model. So the first thing you got to do is, and we just finished a project like this with a logistics organization, and you can have that. The fundamental question is, are the scopes identical, right? And you have a fundamental idea that you're either going to treat all information of a certain class. So let's say in this particular case, the information relating to the transit of these materials, you can either choose to take all of them and treat it the same way. So you could literally consolidate your ISO scope and your CUI scope together. Or what you might find is that's going either to be too expensive or too complex to manage. And then what you're going to do is you're actually going to create separate enclaves where you have the flexibility to have different sets of controls that apply to each. So as an example, let's say you didn't, you have a requirement to do end-to-end encryption and multi-factor authentication in a CMMC CUI enclave, which is required, right, to protect that data. If that's too expensive, too complex, doesn't work well for your customers in the non-DoD space, you may choose to actually separate that enclave so you don't have to apply those controls there. I know you're a 3PAO. That's a very common model that we see in FedRAMP organizations that are both FedRAMP and ISO 27001. It's exceedingly rare. I haven't seen personally somebody who's chosen to implement their FedRAMP scope to be identical to their ISO scope. Generally speaking, they're completely separating the two environments.
Yeah, no, exactly. And we've seen the case of organizations with both commercial and government contracts, and wanting to be able, as you say, create enclaves for each of those. The approach that we've generally taken is looking at information flow and business process. And so, for example, if there's an order entry process and that order entry process is shared across commercial and government contracts, it's a matter of understanding that and whether, in fact, one process can support both of those. Or if there's a customer support organization, we've worked with organizations that said, gee, we're really dealing with COTS products. We're not we don't have any CUI. We're not receiving CUI, but yet when we look at the work that they may be doing in pre-sales to be able to create configuration drawings for government agencies, when we look at support and service areas and see that information that they're collecting in the course of a service call may in fact be CUI that they're creating, kind of creates different issues for them. And so, what we try to preach is the understanding that, where CUI exists within an organization is a function of business process. And if we have a single business process that is supporting both commercial and government contracts, sometimes it's a matter of understanding that those business processes may require re-engineering. The people who are responsible for those business processes may need to be separated, and then to start to think about how it is that you enclave or support that from an IT standpoint, because IT really exists to support the business processes that an organization has created.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And one thing we always point out to folks is that, that when you first arrive at what your current CUI processes look like, you generally don't want to assume that that is the idealized state that we're migrating to. So as an example, if data is being spread, if a more than necessary number of people have access to the information, and or the information is being transmitted across and stored across more systems that are necessary, that is going to be a more complex and expensive enclave to be able to maintain on a go-forward basis and get certified, right? So as an example, if we use that store process transit, if we're able to restrict the number of systems that store process or transit CUI down from 500 to 100, think about the cost savings from a multi-factor authentication and from a SIM perspective alone. So yeah, I agree with you completely. It's really critical that we understand that optimizing our scope of our CUI is a critical step in this process.
Yeah, and an important lesson that we've also seen organizations learn, and some of this relates to to understanding why the documentation requirements behind CMMC is the maturity part of the term cybersecurity maturity model certification. And it's not just a matter of recognizing that an organization has done something or satisfied a requirement, but that it's been institutionalized into practice within an organization. And the way we've kind of likened this to, for others, is to say, remember when you were back, and a kid in school, you had fire drills. Well, why did you have fire drills? In the event that there was an actual fire, you knew what to do, you didn't have to think, and you reacted. And part of CMMC and part of the requirements for documentation come to be able to demonstrate, and not only that you have done something, but that you've established the maturity of having practiced it, having done it, having put it into operation. One example within CMMC requirement, IR 3.099 that requires having an incident response plan. Not enough to have an incident response plan to be able to satisfy the requirement for maturity. It's the ability to demonstrate that not only that you have it, that the people who are involved with that response plan actually know where it exists, know how it operates. And third, that you've got evidence that in fact that you've run a tabletop or a rehearsal, have done kind of a fire drill behind that. And when we again look at CMMC in all, it's really getting OSCs to understand, again, it's not implementing a technical solution, or it's not writing a policy or a procedure document, but it truly is going through the steps of ensuring that that you understand what it is. The person who's responsible for it can explain it to someone else, and that it truly has been institutionalized, and that you can demonstrate that it's something that your organization does, not just something that your organization has.
Yeah, we use the term operationalize, which is, quite the same thing, right? Because you've got, the auditor needs to find two forms of objective evidence, that of persistent habitual execution of a practice, which is a high bar from an audit perspective to be able to pass. So the only way that you can pass that bar and achieve that standard is if, as you're architecting these processes, we're doing so in a way where the idea of that process being fully operationalized in such a way that it is going to, quote unquote, automatically generate the evidence that we need on a persistent basis is the only way that you're going to be successful here. So let's say that under the vulnerability and configuration management requirements, right, you might, let's say, cron your vulnerability tool to run on a periodic basis. You're gonna have that tool put that data in a particular place. We're gonna have some form of a workflow that checks to make sure that that process did take place, and that the individual who was responsible to review that process, review the outcome of that, did, and they opined on whether any actions were necessary, and then they took the appropriate action, and that evidence was created of that entire trail. I mean, that's really the level that you've got to get to be able to pass an audit of this nature. Yeah, I agree completely with you that that's a key part. It's not enough to implement the control. You really got to get it operationalized.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, and back at a former company, we sold a platform for collaboration and secure file transfer. And we noticed that there were several clients that we had sold this to and that had helped them implement it, weren't using it. And we went back to try to check and say, problem with the product, something we need to address. And the response was, well, the requirement under 800-171 is we need to have a means of securely sharing CUI information. We now have a means, but you're not using it. It doesn't say we need to use it under CMMC. That's the big difference. And perhaps that's the reason behind maturity within CMMC. It's really to overcome those shortfalls of 800-171 that cause it to be less effective than it needed to be.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's exactly the reason why we're here today, right? Is the government trusted that we were doing the things that we said we were doing, and we weren't. So the government's going to put its foot down.
Absolutely. Or when it's when you think about compliance. Compliance, unfortunately, is thinking about what is the least cost alternative that will enable me to check a box. Right. And that's a mentality that that isn't going to work with CMMC. And similarly, as you use it, I like the term that you used with respect to relentlessly putting something into operation. You're not going to install something the day before an assessment, or you're not going to write a policy, the ink's still wet when the assessor comes in, and expect that you're going to be able to demonstrate that you've satisfied the maturity requirements that are associated with CMMC.
Right. And one last thing there, and even if you think about this as being a compliance exercise, and please don't, but if you're going to be compliant, you don't need to be compliant with CMMC. You don't need to be compliant with NIST 800-171. You need to be compliant with the DFARS clause
Right.
that includes that amongst other things that you're required to do. So it's really critical. I mean, don't get lost in what you're trying to conform with.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about kind of getting started in the process. And I know we look at this. I think fairly similarly. We may put different labels on some of the steps that we employ in our respective methodologies, but we generally find that the first step in working with a client involves understanding what is CUI, or even whether they have CUI, whether it's CUI they're receiving, whether it's CUI they're creating. And organizations that have come to us and said, well, we know what our CUI boundary is. Generally, we suggest the starting point is, well, really, let's make sure and check that to make sure that you haven't overscoped it. Let's make sure that you haven't underscoped it, and truly, understand what CUI is in your organization and what is not CUI within your organization. So, generally, a first step that we will go through with an organization, ensuring that that they clearly understand and have clearly defined what their CUI boundary is, and if they haven't, working with them to either identify what may be CUI and to determine if in fact it is or not in their view, and to be able to then define a CUI boundary that is defensible and explainable should it be questioned by an assessor, and certainly if there is a subsequent audit of that boundary.
Yeah, I'm amazed at how much time that it takes during the process to actually determine what is or what isn't CUI, and how much confusion there is with regards to that. With diagrams that come across that are not marked explicitly as CUI, but are they, and derivative works and information that we're transferring, whether or not, what differentiates, what moves something from being COTS to CUI, right? And the subtleties of that. And well, we just changed this one little piece. Does that make it CUI? So I think we spend an awful lot of time in that part of the process. We often find that it's necessary not only to talk with the contracting officers, but often to talk with the primes and or the agencies that the contract is flowing from, to gain clarification on this information. We often end up in a case where we don't get the clarification that we need. And then I think that, and we typically recommend that if it looks or smells like CUI, that you are better off treating it as CUI than not. I believe they call it the Christian doctrine, is the requirement that if the government gives you, something that needs to be treated as CUI, but doesn't define it as such, and you fail to treat it that way, that you're obligated to do so, and that you'll be negligent if you didn't. So, where you can't find the answer to that, you're better off erring on the side of treating it as CUI.
But ultimately, the regulation leaves the decision in terms of the determination of whether something is CUI or not CUI with the organization seeking certification. But that doesn't mean they won't be asked to justify that determination. So John, here's a question for you then. If there's so much confusion about CUI, why isn't there a requirement for the government and prime contractors to label CUI when they provide it to OSCs?
You'd have to ask someone smarter than me that question, Stuart.
and I think the answer.
I know our customers would be very much happier. I know our consultants would be a lot happier.
Absolutely.
Because literally, customers don't like being told this is we're 90% sure this is CUI, but they're like, well, but is it? Well, we don't know. I mean, it's it is a challenge in the industry right now. I think we'll get better at it. Both from the government side. I think from the government side, they'll get better at it.
But and I know there's scoping guides.
DAU is right. Isn't DAU the organization that's trying to? I know that aren't they the ones that work with the contracting officers to try to clarify these types of things in contracts?
Right, and I know there are a number of other initiatives, some that are public, some that are private, going on specifically to try to kind of provide clarity around the CUI issue, what is and what isn't. And again, hopefully government and primes will get better at dispatching their responsibility to truly mark that information.
Yeah, but if you take a step back, if we're staying within the CUI level 3 domain, we're not getting to 4 or 5. If it's important business data, treating it in accordance with CMMC level 3 is really what you want to do anyway. right? I mean, because CMMC is a recipe for a very strong information security program. So if it's business critical data and you're going to err on the side of treating it in a way that you've already architected the processes and the systems to handle anyway, I think you could make an argument it's good practice as just a business survival technique to do so.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent point. If an organization was doing a risk assessment, identifying what information it has that is important to its business, that the loss of that information, the theft of that information would cause damage to the business. Certainly applying the type of security that CMMC prescribes, it would seem to make sense for an organization to really control that risk.
Yep. Yeah, I would agree. And so we get through that, like you said. So I think we both agree that, the first step that you got to get is that clear picture. We call it context. We call it scope. It's the idea of understanding FCI, CUI, other business critical data, how that all needs to be, treated, right? Whether or not you have requirements beyond that. We talked about that risk assessment, right? Which is both a requirement of the standard, and the risk assessment also ensures that we understand how robust the controls need to be to manage our risk effectively. We talked about that gap assessment, right? Ensuring that we have an idea of, because CMMC and 171 tend to be a little bit more prescriptive, look specifically at the controls and look at the detail of the control and see if we're implementing it in a manner which is, consistent with that. And then coming out of that phase, right, I'm sure you're in the same place we are, you've got some combination of what we call a gap or risk remediation plan, which is essentially a list of things that need to be done in order for the organization to move towards CMMC certification or 800-171 attestation.
Yeah. And I mean, often after an organization goes through that process of understanding the gaps, we'll often help them explore what are remediation options, how they might approach that and to proceed. Yep. But we typically, will also recommend for a system that is complex or an organization that is complex, after you've gone through, completed a gap assessment, developed a remediation strategy, implemented that remediation strategy, probably going back and kind of going through a second gap assessment or like a mock assessment, so to speak, to ensure the things that you've done satisfy the range of requirements for CMMC, both the technical requirements, the non-technical requirements, and your ability to demonstrate that you've fully documented them in policy, in procedures, and have the exact objective evidence that you need to be able to support them.
Yeah, we tend to call that a readiness assessment, if you will. It's a common phrase in the industry. I think a readiness assessment is often a good idea at the cost of a CMMC audit. You really don't want to invest, whatever that's going to be, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000, depending upon size, scope, things of that nature. When you're writing that large a check, you would like to minimize the likelihood that it's not going to be a successful exercise. A readiness assessment, if you architect your processes right, the readiness assessment won't be that expensive. It won't be that hard to do because, let's say that we implement this using some type of technology to support it. Yep. Now, you could do it with a help desk ticketing system. You could do it with a project management tool like Asana or Reich. You could do it with a GRC tool. But if you implement this in the right way, you literally should be able to sit someone down in front of a system and say, here's the system security plan. And the system security plan should point to, the documentation and controls that I need to see, and should tell us where we can find the operational evidence for each of the controls. And then the operational evidence should be visible in this tool or linked into this tool for us to be able to sit down in front of the help desk ticketing system, open up the associated ticket, and look at the actual evidence and say, is this evidence, right, that's going to pass muster during an audit? Do I have two forms of independent evidence? And does the evidence match what we said we were going to do?
Right. And being able to ensure that when you actually look at what's being implemented, it matches the objective evidence, it matches the documentation.
Yep.
And so
it's ticking and tying.
Right. Absolutely. It's consistency that is key. One of the topics you and I spoke about, John, was trust. And we hear a lot of talk about zero trust and zero trust solutions and where they have no place today. But I think we've agreed that trust is important for an OSC when they're going through this process of not only selecting somebody to help them through this journey, but also trust with respect to the things that they choose.
Yeah, so we have a phrase that we use internally called a trusted ecosystem, and our goal has been over the last few years to increasingly build out what we refer to as a trusted ecosystem of service providers, people, products, that we know that work well for organizations in certain conditions. CMMC, because the standard is very prescriptive, and because many of the companies that are beholden to CMMC live in similar spaces like the manufacturing space, it makes it very easy for you to identify a set of products and a set of companies that are idealized to be able to provide these services to these organizations. And if you can work with someone that can help you act as a trusted advisor, themselves be part of your trusted ecosystem, but your trusted ecosystem grows by their trusted ecosystem. What that does is it de-risks the project quite a bit. So as an example, if this organization knows that this particular SIM solution will work well in your use case because they've used it, seen other organizations use it that way, that's going to benefit you, right? You don't need to go to market, look at 12 solutions. You don't need to implement a solution and find out that it doesn't work the way that you thought it does. Second thing is you're going to need a lot of people to help you get there that are going to support these technologies, and again, so as an example, we've been in this industry for 20 plus years. I've known you for a long time. We know who the RPOs are. We know who the ISO registrars are. We know who are all the people in the industry, in the food chain. And when you've worked with them and they've earned your trust, then it makes it easy for you to make those recommendations to somebody else. So what that does for them is, like I said, is it de-risks the project. It also shortens their time to actually achieve certification.
Right. And I mean, I think you talked about trust in choosing partners, and one point I think is important for organizations to understand. There's a lot of great choices out there and a lot of great people that you can choose to work with to support you through this journey. But not everybody who kind of puts up a sign and says, I can help you with CMMC is necessarily fully qualified or as qualified. There is freedom of speech and anybody can say, I have these credentials, I have this ability to help you. It really is important for you to make sure that you vet the organization that you choose to work with as a partner and can trust them. You're looking for somebody who not only knows the framework, but knows and understands the technology stack that you may be working with. There are some, if you're in the Microsoft stack, who understand that better and are able to advise you. There's others, if you're working in AWS or whatever that environment may be. And it's about being able to look at the requirements from the lens of maturity and risk rather than compliance. But second, it's being able to look at it from the perspective of an assessor, because ultimately, where there's any ambiguity, you want to assure that you're satisfying those requirements from the perspective of the person who's going to be grading you and scoring you. There's a very prescriptive grading scale. It's the assessment guide. It's about 430 pages long. But in a advisory organization that also has the basis of being either a assessment organization or having people who've gone through that training, can certainly assure that that you've been able to, or that the advice that they're giving you is based on the framework, their knowledge of the framework, and based on an understanding of how you're going to be assessed, not how they think you may be assessed, or this will probably be good enough. Again, very little wiggle room with respect to the requirements for CMMC. Again, this was another adjustment from 800-171. 800-171 suffered because people were able to apply their own interpretation of what satisfied a control. CMMC kind of went to the lengths of saying, these are the things that you should look for. This is what satisfies this. And if you're working with somebody who doesn't bring that understanding in depth, you're likely not to get the advice that you need.
The one thing I would add there that I was frankly shocked by, because my background is not in the DIB. So when this all started, we've been doing, ISO 27001 and all these standards for years. So I was like, oh, sure, we should be in the CMMC space. And we became an RPO. And, I'm an RP, and we had people to take and pass the test. And I will tell you that you start to get into conversations and you realize how important it is that somebody comes out of the DIB space, how important it is that someone comes out of the NIST space. So that would be my guidance to people is, you know, look, it's great if somebody's an RPO. It's great if someone is a CCP. It's great if somebody is part of a C3PAO. You know, I think you need to have 3 distinct fields of knowledge to be very good at helping a client get prepped for this. You know, one is you have to have that broad information security knowledge. You can't be doing this a week or a month. You've got to have, you know, a long history of being able to do this, understand the implementation of technical controls, have experience with the technologies that are necessary to do this. I think the second thing that you need is someone who comes a little bit out of this particular space. You know, somebody who has worked on the government side, let's say conducting these audits or assessments, or someone who's lived on your side of the fence and has been beholden to NIST 800-171 or has been beholden to frameworks of this nature, because there is subtlety to this, understanding the language, understanding what it means if there's a no foreign requirement or no rel requirement or ITAR. You know, we've had 2 or 3 clients come to us recently that had been working with somebody and went down a very wrong path because these organizations just didn't understand the answers that they were getting. And, you know, and then the third thing is NIST is, you know, I'm an ISO guy, I'm a NIST guy. NIST is different. NIST has a lot of subtlety and interpretation that doesn't exist in ISO. And you want to work with somebody who's done, you know, some fairly significant NIST work prior. Maybe some RMF work would be something that, or 800-171 work would make you feel pretty comfortable.
Yeah. And again, I think it just emphasizes the importance of choosing, you know, the right guide to help you through this
Yeah,
process.
no question. No question.
And the other area of trust, and I think, you know, it's similar, is with respect to cloud service providers or other means that you could choose. You know, one thing that we talk a lot about clients doing is leveraging cloud services. Cloud services often satisfy a number of the technical requirements for CMMC, and you can inherit those requirements as a result of working with an independent cloud service. If you're working with AWS, they have a placemat that shows the items that the AWS platform satisfies for an organization. Put a SaaS product on top of it. It not only satisfies certain requirements through the application it provides, but also inherits and brings those things from AWS. Microsoft similarly provides a customer responsibility matrix of those things that you inherit as a result of adopting Microsoft. But again, choosing which cloud service and being able to trust those things that that they claim are inherited are important. A brand name, if you're using Salesforce, if you're using ServiceNow, those services are ones that that are likely going to be trusted and regarded. If you're using a service like, you know, Bob's, you know, certainly, you know, they may require a higher level of scrutiny. But you know, cloud services, and finally, you know, the use of reference architectures that have been created to define how you plug and assemble a compliant CMMC or a solution that meets the technical requirements of CMMC is certainly another avenue that that organizations can take in looking at, you know, how is it that I can make my journey shorter? How is it I can de-risk the journey of being able to satisfy these requirements, and how can I reduce the costs associated with them?
Yeah, this is a really critical, and this is a great example of where the DFARS requirement gives you a piece of information that CMMC doesn't. So, you know, if you look at DFARS 7012, what it mandates is that an organization, if you take your CUI and you put it up into a cloud service provider, that cloud service provider is required to have FedRAMP moderate or equivalent. Recently, I believe it was the CMMC AB, one of our guys told me that somebody clarified that, or it was the DoD, clarified that to mean either a FedRAMP ATO or the equivalent of a readiness assessment report or an assessment done by a 3PAO. PreVeil, our sponsor here today, right, is a great solution for email and end-to-end encryption of email and for secure file transfer. And they recently went through a FedRAMP moderate ATO and have that report so that you can actually use them. If you take CUI and you put it up into a cloud service and you don't validate that they pass that test, you are not going to pass your CMMC audit.
And that's a means where, again, it's the basis for trust by having that CMMC, I'm sorry, that FedRAMP ATO or that badge of FedRAMP equivalency as a result of having a readiness.
Yeah, done
decision.
by a 3PAO. That's what the current requirement is. So
Exactly.
you know, like, and there are people, I can tell you unequivocally, there are people out there that are selling systems for secure file transfer that do not have a FedRAMP ATO or equivalent.
Right.
And I
So
know
ju-
clients that have bought their product and were not happy when, you know, we said, look, that's not going to pass muster. Well, they told us it would.
Right.
Well, here's what it says in the standard. Look, right. Well, no one ever showed us the standard. That's not CMMC. That's D4 7012. Yeah, 7012, you know, gets stacked on to, you know,
Right.
onto 7021 when you get a 7021 requirement. And this is what it says.
Right, and a good advisor can, you know, certainly help an organization avoid those pitfalls. I know you know, one thing we said we wanted to touch on, and I know we're kind of running a little bit short on time, common implementation pain points. And I'm going to try to put up a one slide that that I think that you provided. Let's see if this is going to work.
Is that a picture of your dog, Stuart?
I'm sorry?
That picture of your dog? I'm kidding with you. You have the slide up. I just wanted to see you sweat a little bit.
Yeah. So, you know, we see a number of challenges that seem to represent, you know, the most common challenges of organizations. Oddly enough, you know, when we spoke with the DIBCAC back in the days of just 800-171 assessment, you know, they would invariably say if somebody, you know, had a problem, they'd say, oh, well, I bet it was multi-factor authentication, and I bet it was FIPS 140-2 encryption. And invariably, those tend to be among the most challenging. But John, I know that you know that you threw this or put this slide together, and maybe we can kind of talk through what we've seen as kind of the common implementation pain points that organizations have found.
Yeah. So look, I mean, I think, you know, starting with that end-to-end encryption and ensuring that, you know, that you've got a mechanism by which you can communicate, you know, CUI information with a third party, whether that's email or whether that's sent through some form of secure file transfer. You know, like I mentioned, obviously PreVeil is a good solution for that. You can do a lot of things with that. You know, again, if you're going to, you know, please understand conventional Microsoft or conventional Google Mail is not going to work for this type of a requirement. So, you know, it is a significant pain point for organizations, and it is a very critical decision point. Of course, that ties into that email spam protection as well. You know, so you can layer these things together. You might be able to get both from the same service provider. So you'll have to look at that. We've talked about. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and one that people sometimes don't understand is email sandboxing. You may want to just touch and explain email sandboxing.
Yeah. So email sandboxing is a process by which the email gets sent through a third party. They will look at the email and or the attachment, and they will actually open the email attachment and verify that that attachment did not contain any type of a poisoned payload. It wasn't like a word macro that was intending to infect your machine with a remote access Trojan or something of that nature. So what this does is gives you a much higher level of protection against malware and, you know, remote access type things getting into your network through email.
Good.
I think folks are familiar with MDM, mobile device management. You know, a lot of times now we've got email on our phones. If that email is going to be email on your phone is going to involve CUI, then we've got to make sure that we're affording it the same protections as if it was being sent from your mail server or from your desktop. You guys are probably familiar with multi-factor authentication by now. That is a second factor for authentication. It's no longer sufficient just to have a password. You need a second method of validating that you are who you are. That could be through, it's either, you know, who you are, or what you have. So most frequently you're doing the second factor through like a push SMS notification, or preferably a push to app notification, which is a little bit more secure. It's less subject to an SMS, a smishing style attack. SIM is a significant or some form of logging with alerting. Most frequently people would refer to this as SIM, or Security Information Event Management. That's if you look at the requirements of CMMC, somewhere around 50% of the requirements are positively impacted by some type of a solution, some type of a SIM solution. And then the last thing, of course, is you have to be very cognizant of the fact that, where does that data flow? Where does the CUI flow outside of your organization? That which is flowing directly back to the prime or flowing directly back to the agency is one thing. But if you're using third parties, to be integral to delivering the service, and you need to share this information, again, under DFAR 7012, there's a requirement, I think it's clause M, that flows down that objective, that requirement, to ensure that these third parties that you're doing it to have similar protections. So this is a big issue. And this is, I think, one of the bigger issues that most of the folks that we're working with in the supply chain have a concern about, is that they work with many small, sheet metal vendors and people of that nature. And they're saying there's no way that they're going to get CMMC level 3. So now you get into using the idea of that enclave that we talked about. And there's ways of using, as an example, your PreVeil OneDrive as an enclave for sharing information to a downstream vendor in a way that meets CMMC requirements, but doesn't require them to become CMMC certified. So that's a huge issue that we need to work through, usually during a pre-certification effort, helping people get ready.
And kind of back to where we started, and making it clear this is not about compliance. It's about cyber maturity and being able to demonstrate cyber maturity. When we look at some of those key challenges that exist, it's important that somebody who's implementing or addressing it, understanding what's the problem that's addressing. Why are we doing logging and evaluation? Why are we doing two-factor authentication, and ensuring that in fact we've put adequate protection around the things that we're doing. And we start to think about multi-factor authentication to ensure that you're protecting against theft of a device or identity theft and so forth. We've seen algorithms that have been implemented to look at things that go as far as impossible travel, that if somebody tries to log in from their home in Washington, D.C., and a half an hour later there's a login from San Francisco, not possible, and something that gets flagged. It's, how did those things evolve? They evolved because people looked at this from a risk lens and trying to understand, what is it that we truly need to do to secure this information, either the information that the government has entrusted with us in the course of serving them as a client, or, as John pointed out, the really important information that we have within our business. And with that, I think we're right at time. Orly, if you're on, I don't know if there were any questions.
I am like that woman behind the curtain.
Right.
I'm always here. Thank you, gentlemen.
So
This
should
was
we call
wonderful.
you Oz?
Sure. Sure. You can call me Oz. Gentlemen, this was wonderful. Thank you very much for taking the time to give such an in-depth discussion.